Hi, I'm Laura Marsh. I'm the literary editor of The New Republic. Welcome to this Salon at the Strand. This is a series of monthly events where we talk to the authors of new books. Today, I'm delighted to be here with Vivian Gornick. One mic drop already into the performance. I can get that for you.
I lost the microphone.
Yeah. There you go. You're meant to say something really scathing and then drop the mic. These are I feel perilously perched up here. So we're talking tonight about Vivian's new book, Unfinished Business, Notes of a Chronic Rereader. Copies of the book are on sale tonight, and at the end, Vivian will be signing them, so make sure you stick around for that. Okay, so I think Vivian is going to start with a reading.
Okay. Yes, we're going to start with a reading. This book is fashioned as kind of half memoir, half a literary criticism. Actually, the idea of rereading has gone through a million configurations and interpretations over many, many years in many countries and many cultures. So it's hardly an original idea but it is influenced by the time in which we live, that I started to reread in a way that was meant to echo the changes in my own life as I went on and as the books went on, right? So this introduction is, I'm going to trace a little bit. I'm going to trace the way in which I approached it. So it will, the trajectory is various elements of development in my own life and the way I read at each different time. So I'm just going to read from the introduction, not the whole introduction. You can hear me, right? It has often been my experience that rereading a book that was important to me at earlier times in my life is something like lying on the analyst's couch. The narrative I've had by heart for years is suddenly being called into alarming question. It seems that I've misremembered quite a lot about this or that character or this or that plot turn. They met here in New York. I was sure it was Rome. The time was 1870. I thought it was 1900. And the mother did what to the protagonist? Yet the world still drops away while I'm reading, and I can't help marveling. If I got this wrong and this wrong, how come the book still has me in its grip? Like most readers, I sometimes think I was born reading. I can't remember the time when I didn't have a book in my hands, my head lost to the world around me. On vacation with family or friends, I am quite capable of settling myself, book in hand, on the living room couch in a beautiful country house and hardly stirring out into the glorious green for which we have all come. Once, on a train going through the Peruvian Andes, with everyone else oohing and eyeing out the window, I couldn't lift my eyes from the woman in white. Even that makes me, it was true. On a Caribbean beach, I sat in the blazing sun. Diane Johnson's Lesser Lives, an imagined biography of George Meredith's first wife, propped on my knees, and was surprised when I looked up to see that I wasn't surrounded by the fog and cold of 1840s England. The companionate of those books, of all books, nothing can match it. It's the longing for coherence inscribed in the work, that extraordinary attempt at shaping the inchoate through words. It brings peace and excitement, comfort and consolation. But above all, it's the sheer relief from the chaos in the head that reading delivers. Sometimes I think it alone provides me with courage for life, and that from earliest childhood. We lived in an immigrant working class neighborhood in the Bronx where all needs were met through the patronage of one of the many stores on a single major shopping street. The butcher, the baker, the grocer, the banker, the drugstore, the shoe repair, all storefront operations. One day when I was quite small, 7 or 8, my mother, holding my hand, walked us into a store I'd never before noticed. It was the local branch of the New York Public Library. New York is full of them. The room was long, the floorboards bare, and the walls lined floor to ceiling with books. In the middle of the room was planted a desk at which sat Eleanor Roosevelt. In those days, all librarians looked like Eleanor Roosevelt. A tall, bosomy woman with a mass of gray hair piled Belle Epoque style on top of her head, rimless glasses perched high on her incredibly straight nose, and a look of calm interest in her eyes. My mother approached the desk, pointed at my head, and said to Eleanor Roosevelt, "She likes to read." The librarian stood up, said, "Come," and walked me back to the front of the store where the children's books were sectioned. "Start here," she said, and I did. Between then and the time I graduated from high school, I read my way around the room. If I'm asked now to remember what I read in that storefront library, I can only recall that I went from Grimm's fairy tales to Little Women to Of Time in the River. Then I entered college, where I discovered that all these years I'd been reading literature. It was at that moment, I think, that I began rereading, because from then on, it was the books that had become my intimates, to which I would turn again and again, not only for the transporting pleasure of the story itself, but also to understand what I was living through and what I was to make of it. I'd grown up in a noisy left-wing household where Karl Marx and the international working class were articles of faith. Feeling strongly about social injustice was a given. So from the start, the politicalness of life colored almost all tangible experience, which of course included reading. I read ever and only to feel the power of life with a capital L, as it manifested itself thrillingly through the protagonist's engagement with those external forces beyond his or her control. In this way, I felt acutely but equally the work of Dickens, Dreiser, and Hardy, as well as Mike Gold, John Dos Passos, and Agnes Smedley. I had to laugh when a few years ago I came across an essay by Delmore Schwartz in which he, Schwartz, takes Edmund Wilson to task for Wilson's shocking lack of interest in literary form. For Schwartz, form was integral to the meaning of a literary work. For Wilson, what mattered was not how books were written, but what they were talking about and how they affected the culture at large. His habit always was to place a book in its social and political context. This perspective allowed him to pursue a line of thought that let him speak of Proust and Dorothy Parker in the same sentence, or compare Max Easton favorably with André Gide. For Schwartz, this was pure pain. For me, it was inexpressibly rewarding. And what could have been more natural than that the way I read was the way I would begin to write? Now, this whole middle section is about me going to work at the Village Voice and becoming a passionate polemicist, discovering joyfully, very joyfully, feminism, going on the barricades of the 1970s, and rereading everything from that point of view. Most important, of course, that I saw immediately, what we all saw, was that the hero of every book was a man, and women were there to either thwart or encourage him. Right? Didn't look good anymore. So I was reading all the other ones. And we were all, there was a mob of people, women, who were all seeing things exactly as I was seeing them. And we were all meeting constantly, and we were all talking about books we had just read yesterday that we'd read 30 years ago, etc. So, okay. That's the good part. Yet, by no means was it all bread and roses. I mean, feminism. For example, no one had counted on the level of rage the women's movement had released in men and in women alike. Strong enough, it seemed sometimes, that it could set a match to the world, the anger. Every day, marriages broke up, friendships ended, family members became estranged, and perfectly decent people were saying and doing the most abominable things to one another. One night at a dinner party, a pair of academics, one a tall, slim woman, the other a short, fat man, were listening intently to a distinguished historian whose field the woman knew well. She was adding her voice to that of the speaker with an occasional question or comment when her colleague impatiently demanded that she stop interrupting. At any other time within living memory, I was certain this woman would have fallen silent after receiving such a rebuke. Now, her face hardened, and she spat out, "Why, you ugly little man, don't you tell me to stop speaking." I'm so glad you weren't there. The table went silent, and within minutes, the evening was breaking up. I sat there stunned. On the one hand, I was thrilled by the woman's outburst. On the other, the loss of civility among us left me with a taste of ashes in my mouth. Who could have imagined that so much hate and fear had been festering for so long inside so many of us? Now we know. Within the decade, 1970s feminists came to realize that while we stood united in political analysis, ideology alone was not about to deliver us from our damaged selves. Between the ardor of our rhetoric and the dictates of flesh and blood reality, it seemed lay a no man's land of untested conviction. We became then, many of us, a walking embodiment of the gap between theory and practice, the discrepancy between what we declared we felt and the miserable complexity of what we actually felt, more apparent with each passing day. The contradictions in my own character rose up daily to plague me, and patterns of behavior I had paid no attention to suddenly loomed large. I had always thought of myself as one of those ordinarily decent people who placed a high value on what is generally called good character. Now I saw that I did nothing of the sort. In conversation, I was cutting and confrontational, at family affairs, bored and dismissive, in the office, self-regarding to a fault. Although I pined endlessly for intimate connection, I thought, I nonetheless sabotaged one relationship after another by concentrating almost exclusively on what I took to be my needs, not at all those of my friend or lover. The narrowness of experience to which my own self-divisions had consigned me, how appalling that now felt. In no time at all, an unimagined universe of interiority opened before me, one equipped with its own theory, laws, and language, constituting a worldview that seemed to hold more truth, that is more inner reality than any other. And a drama of internal anguish began to unfold. Every day now I struggled with myself, one part of me pitted against another, reason telling me which behaviors to break free of, compulsion demanding that I ignore reason. Again and again, I suffered the humiliation of sustained self-defeat. In the goodness of analytic time, it became clear, but this took years to absorb, that insight alone was never going to prove sufficient. The effort required to attain some semblance of an integrated self was going to be the test of a lifetime. As the great Anton Chekhov had so memorably put it, while others might have made me a slave, it was I who must squeeze the slave out of myself drop by drop. Once again, I found myself reading differently. I took out the books, novels in particular, I had read and reread and read them again. This time around, I saw that whatever the story, whatever the style, whatever the period, the central drama in literary work was nearly always dependent on the perniciousness of the human self-divide, the fear and ignorance it generates, the shame it gives rise to, the debilitating mystery in which it enshrouds us. I also saw that invariably what made the work of a good book affecting, and this was something implicit in the writing, trapped somewhere in the nerves of the prose, was some haunted imagining, as though coming from the primeval unconscious, of human existence with the rift healed, the parts brought together, the hunger for connection put in brilliant working order. Great literature, I thought then and think now, is a record not of the achievement of wholeness of being, but of the ingrained effort made on its behalf. Thank you. Okay, 12 minutes?
Are you good with the handheld microphone there, or do you want him to keep that one? If you prefer the other one, we can stick with that. You were just projecting beautifully.
Oh, no,
so
you
yeah,
were there.
yeah.
Okay, sorry.
So we skipped the part in that where you talk about working at the Village Voice.
Yes.
But so before we get to rereading, I want to get to just reading and becoming a writer. It's something you've written about a little bit before, going to work at the Voice, discovering how to write and how to kind of project yourself into the world. You kind of started as a polemicist. And I still think of
Definitely.
you as one of the critics who always comes at a book with a point of view.
Absolutely.
But so do you feel that the mode of polemic that you operated in then, in some ways had to be the start of this project of rereading because it was so sharp and it was so, you were discovering ideology of one kind.
Yes, that is true. The ideology was sort of a built-in. Well, first of all, at the Village Voice, the Village Voice was constantly holding a gun to society's head. That's what we did. So everybody there was a polemicist. Everyone there was empowered by a strong sense of viewpoint, and it always had to do with social crisis. That was everybody's shtick. And mine became feminism. Once I found that, I found myself. Otherwise, I wrote a lot at The Voice without, I think, being in any particular way any more striking than everybody else. But once I became a feminist, then I saw my way to use myself. It taught me that. And it taught me what I now conceive of as narrative writing, personal journalism, the nonfiction that we now almost all practice, in which you use yourself. Yourself is not the point. Your feelings, your thoughts, you're in other words, if you sit down to write about how you feel about something, you're lost. If you sit down to use your feelings to talk about something more important or something else, then you make good use of polemics. You're still being a polemicist, which I was then, always on the barricades for radical feminism, and able to use myself easily. It was a time in a world in which I walked out in the street. I ran into somebody I'd gone to school with. And the next thing I had a piece by 6 o'clock in the evening, and it was always something to make you think about it. And I was always seeing sexism everywhere I looked. So I could write about a doorknob and I'd see sexism, and I did. So yes, when I came to the end of that kind of work, when I stopped wanting to do that, it stood me in great stead. It had taught me the meaning of a point of view. Mm-hmm. Just now, the point of view was going to turn inward instead of outward.
So, and those early pieces were, you were talking to people like Shulamit Firestone, or you were going to report on stuff happening in the streets. Mm-hmm. When did you turn to literary criticism?
Well, I did literary criticism there. I mean, I did everything. I did book reviewing there, and I began to get more serious. I was raw. I hardly understood the distinction between writing a book review or an essay or developing a critical point of view. Everything was, I did know that I couldn't say, I feel about this book. Mm-hmm. I read this book and I really liked it. Or I read this book and I really didn't like it. That wouldn't do, So that was all as I matured and turned away from that kind of writing. It just seemed natural to get more and more serious about book reading.
And so some of those early books that you wrote about were feminist books, right? Like I read, you wrote the introduction to the Scum Manifesto.
Oh, yeah. Right.
This is this amazing essay, but I can see how that would have matched up with where you were as a feminist polemicist and also this literary critic, finding your voice and talking about the self-divide. I mean, that theme seems to have been in your work
without
pretty
my
much from the
it.
very beginning. I mean, it's definitely become more intense and more complex, but in that piece, it really feels like that.
I guess as soon as I entered psychoanalysis,
the most subtle reading of Valerie Solanas of anyone ever.
Does anybody or everybody here know what the Scum Manifesto was? Should I tell?
You heard of Valerie?
Should I tell?
Yeah, go ahead.
Scum Manifesto, the Society for Cutting Up Men. Wasn't that it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Valerie Solanas was an inspired crazy of the time. You may all remember she shot Andy Warhol. She was really on her way to shoot Maurice Grotius, but he wasn't in the office. So she went on to she was an outlier of the first order. She was crazy. She was many things. Really a marginal of the worst sort, and she was brilliant. She was brilliant in her own way. She wrote this little thing, The Scum, which was insane, and she called men an abortion all the way through, and it's nutty, but it's like saline. It's a kind of a misanthropic view that just has a little bit of genius locked into it. So it was published originally, I can't remember when exactly, but much earlier. Anyway, in 1970, Maurice Gerodius called me up and asked me if he was going to read. By this time, she was in jail. She'd shot Andy Warhol, and she was in jail. But she was writing him letters like, Gerodius, when I get out, and cut your balls off. That's how she would begin a letter very often. So I said, what, are you kidding? We are respectable feminists. She is crazy. Well, I'm not going to write it. He said, have you read it? I said, no, I hadn't read it. So he said, just read it. So I read it, and it was inspired in its own mad way. So I said, okay. And then I regretted it later because she got out of jail, and she started to dog me. She called me up late at night, and she said, what do you know about the English edition? What do you know about the Irish edition? What do you know about the Italian edition? I didn't know anything about anything. All I knew was I wrote the piece, and I got my money, and that was the end of it. But she made me crazy, and she tracked me down in Colorado. She tracked me down in Israel. And I was scared. And then one night, she called me at 3 a.m. And this time I forgot to be scared. I got angry. I said, don't you dare ever call me again. And she never did. See, a girl should always be more angry than scared.
That is an amazing story. So I've always thought of you for your whole career as a feminist literary critic. You wrote a book called The Men in My Life.
That was a joke.
There's a wonderful title. The men are like Philip Roth and Saul
Yeah,
Bellow.
the men in my life are the men I've written about.
Yeah.
It has a thesis. It's literary criticism. What it was, and every man I knew congratulated me on having become so tolerant. I was writing about great writers in whom I was being sympathetic to their depression, as well as I suddenly turned sympathetic to people whom I had refused sympathy to before, and they were all great writers. So they were the men in my life.
So I bring up that book because part of this book is you talk about discovering feminism, and it gives you access to this whole new world of interiority, and then you run up against its limits. And it seemed like the rest of your career was this struggle between the insights of feminism and then all of the other work that you just have to do yourself as a human being to understand other people and to understand yourself. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, the feeling of that first outburst of feminism, the second wave feminism, coming to an end in the 70s. Late 70s, early 80s, and where that left you as a writer, where that pushed you to go as a writer.
Oh, well, I've written about that too in other places. In a way, they were congruent. At the same time that I was discovering the wonders of psychoanalysis and the ways that we've been talking about it, of recognizing what's happening in yourself and in the whole world, and recognizing, as Chekhov said in his own way, I had to squeeze the slave out of myself drop by drop, and ideology couldn't help me, and psychoanalysis alone couldn't help me, and nothing alone helps anybody. So at that time, though, I had deeply, deeply counted on having feminism as a companion for the rest of my life. I thought we really had what was called, not community, but we had comradeship. I mean, there were hundreds of women who all we wanted to do was be with each other and make a revolution. And for a lot of years, it felt like that. Then it came to an end. We hadn't gotten far enough, and we couldn't keep repeating the same thing. That's essentially what it comes to. All activism ends in that way. You say it, and you say it, and you say it, and the world doesn't change enough, and then the differences among you begin to crowd in, and suddenly, this one's your friend, but that one's not your friend, etc. And that whole sense of a world, you could be alone in your room, and you felt the world around you, because it was. Then you were really on your own. And I, as a writer, then I wrote about how it deepened my struggle with writing, not the writing itself, but my commitment to doing it. And at the end, I felt every day that I struggled to work, I was being a feminist. I associated the two in that way. So that struggle, that gift, and that bereftness that feminism gave me worked in this way, I felt. It was very romantic, very, very melodramatic.
So two phrases really leapt out at me in the book as kind of very Vivian Gornick phrases. Life with a capital L is one. And then the other one is life with the lid on, which comes up in the Elizabeth Bowen chapters. That's from Elizabeth Bowen.
That's her.
And those two phrases to me seem to sum up the kind of poles of this struggle that you're talking about. Do you want to tell us about your readings of Bowen?
Bowen is a great English writer. I'm sure you were familiar with her. No, maybe not. Before you even came to the United States. She was a great writer of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, Anglo-Irish, and very difficult writer. She was working at the time of Virginia Woolf, Rosamund Lehman. A whole bunch of English women were writing at very much the same time, and she was really one of the great ones. She wrote constantly in very odd and original and difficult ways about what she called life with the lid on, which was to say her subject was the terrible consequence of suppressed feeling. And she took that idea and she colored it. She put that into every one of her characters and her plots. And it was a whole way of seeing things. She made it seem like one of the great crimes against life, that people should live with life with the lid on and not be open and available, emotionally available to each other. And these are very simple words, but she wrote brilliant books out of that feeling, out of that perception. I put Elizabeth Bowen into this book exactly for those reasons. And she was a great example of how I had to get to a certain point in life where I could read her. I read her when I was young and I didn't understand her at all. And I read her again when I was a little older and I still couldn't get it. And then suddenly.
The major test case in this book for this rereading to me seems to be the D.H. Lawrence, your relationship with sons and lovers. A lot of books in this book are referred to as scripture. At some point they have occupied. They're not just books, they're these texts that you're living with and reading to interpret in this kind of religious way almost. And Sons and Lovers changes so many, every time you read it. Can you give us a sense of those shifts and how they played out?
As I said in the piece that I wrote on it, and I am not alone, by the way, for many, many people, many writers, it's a touchstone, that book. It's hard to say why, but it is. I read it 3 times between the ages of 20 and 35. And each time I read it, I identified with another character in the book and saw myself and everything differently. When I first read it, I was 20 years old. A teacher in school put the book in my hands, and that was it. I went to City College. City College, when I was there, we were called the last of the proletarian Harvard. You know, we were all working class kids, and we were all ethnics, Jewish, Irish, Italian, that was our ethnicity. And all we wanted to do is talk. The teachers were not great teachers. You know, there was not a great faculty. We weren't great intellectually, but we were all on fire with wanting to read and wanting to talk. And so all that they had to do was put the books in our hands, and they did. And Sons and Lovers was just about the first. And I went home and read it, and I identified immediately with Miriam, who's being pressed to give up her virginity to Paul Morella, and she adores him and wants desperately to hold on to him, but she doesn't really want to do it. And boy, can I get into that. I was like, I didn't know what I was doing. She didn't know what she was doing. We were meant for each other. And then later, I identified later on with another character, another lover, and then finally with he himself. When I finally got to feel I was the hero of my own life, I was Paul Morell. How does that strike you?
Well, at least you weren't David Copperfield.
No, that's true.
So that's an interesting question. The line you have in the book is something along the lines of when you became more preoccupied by desiring than being desired. And
Look at the things you pick up on.
oh, but that's something I've noticed in your work through over the years. That phrase comes up, and it comes up in your early feminist writing. Women are too preoccupied with being desired. And then you get there to this point of identification with the male character.
Right.
People talk a lot about representation in books now, and wanting strong female characters. I mean, how important do you think that is? Do you think the reading,
I
the
really
active...
don't know what that word means, and every time I ask what it means, some academic gets angry at me. What does representation mean? Does everybody know? You know.
Wait, so on the simplest level,
What is it?
For what we're talking about,
Yeah,
it would just be,
right.
what if it was Paula Morell? What if it was a woman? Would this be a more fruitful reading experience for you? Or do you feel like actually the reading experience itself is so creative that you're going to be Vivian Gornick reading the book no matter what? So it doesn't really matter who the characters are.
No. Is that what you mean by representation in the sort of sociological or
yeah, I mean,
way
I'm
that
really
we're
just talking about, the Western canon is so dominated by male protagonists.
What feminism, when we began to see, or when I began to see that all the protagonists were men, and to see what that meant, and to realize I had spent my whole life, of course, as everyone in a civilization does, you identify with the heroes that you're given. So we all identify with that. When I came to realize that that almost all the female figures in almost all the books I was reading were stick figures. They didn't have much real life themselves. They were never the protagonists. They were never searching. They were never, on the visionary quest. I didn't want to break up all those books. I didn't want to tear them up or, scissor them out of the world or turn the men into women. I just wanted to see more of the other.
Right.
That's all. I mean, I think most of us felt like that. The generations that have succeeded mine are much angrier than we were, really much, much angrier. And one of the reasons is it's been too little, too late. It's not enough has happened. So people, when we were really quite gingerly, and I think in a lot of our, they weren't demands. We were pointing things out. We were naming the thing that was to preoccupy us, and it didn't. It wasn't off with their heads with us. It really wasn't. Not in any part of our approach, I think.
Except Valerie Solanas.
Yeah.
Just her.
Yes, right. It all felt very antisocial when the civility really began to go. It did go. It went repeatedly, but never felt as sharp as it does now. Yeah.
So I think this is probably the final question I have time to ask. It's kind of a big one. Certainly there has been a school of critics who strove for a kind of Olympian objectivity in their writing about books. And you've always taken opposite approach. And this book weaves together stories about your mother and relationships that you've had, as well as just being inherently personal, I think, in the readings of the books. Who are you reading, where did that approach come from?
My editor.
And why did you find it, why have you stuck with it? Why is it so important to you?
What, to mix my own...
To mix memoir and criticism. So I think of it, your previous book, The Odd Woman in the City, is a memoir.
Yeah.
It actually contains huge amounts of literary criticism. This is a book of literary criticism that contains lots of memoir.
Yeah. I guess in the end I have to say, I have to recognize myself how much that does characterize my work. I've always felt more at home, beginning with the concrete and the specific, and then moving out from there, rather than the other way around. And I think in my hands, literary criticism without that would be a lot less appetizing.
I think it would be less. It would be less fun.
Yeah,
There's less potential
me.
for discovery.
Yeah, it
Do
just
you
seems
feel
natural.
like, since this is a book about rereading, using the personal has ever misled you, and that now, looking back, you would see something completely differently, because it was so personal at the time?
Oh. Well, in this book, I think the only good example I have of that is Colette. Right. When I was a girl, when I was 22, 3 years old, me and my friends, we all adored Colette. She was like the book of wisdom for us. She could make of a woman in love what Tolstoy made of War and Peace. It was that powerful to us. We felt as if in her depictions of the search for, or the devotion to, an erotic passion as the central experience of life. We felt that she captured in that everything that we could be in this world, every kind of important adventure that one could have, everything that one could legitimately, if you wanted a large life, this was the way in. And she was very persuasive. We were enraptured by her. We memorized her, and now I read her as a more than grown up, and it crashes. It just crashes. I don't feel at all anymore about her work. All I have to do is say to myself, would any young woman today read her as I read her? And the question answers itself. It's just the depth with which she was seen to have explored this experience, this idea of experience, it just doesn't hold up. I'm not at all sorry I had both experiences, but that is the way it looks now. But otherwise, almost never.
Right, it seems like the readings build up rather than one
Tear
negating
down.
the other.
Oh, yeah, mostly, yeah, yeah.
Okay, well, so I think now we have to go to the audience for questions. So if you have a question for Vivian, just raise your hand and someone will bring a microphone over to you. Someone must have a question. Okay, here.
I got.
Okay, great.
Can I ask about a particular author? Yeah, sure. Lately I've been reading women who wrote in mid-century, before really feminism took hold. Like,
Which century?
well, the 20th. So like Elizabeth Bowen, but also Mary McCarthy and Muriel Spark. And I want to ask you about Dawn Powell in particular. I know you wrote a review extolling her diaries, but you were disappointed, I think you said, in her novels. Somewhat brittle was the word you used.
What did I say?
Brittle, I believe you called it. And to me, she's like the greatest comic novelist, really, of a generation. I don't understand why her reputation isn't much bigger. What really is your beef with Dawn Powell?
Well, you're not alone. Bitch with Dawn. You read the books. Dawn Powell was a great satirist, was taken to be great in the 20s and 30s. She came to New York from Cleveland, Ohio. She came to conquer the big city and become the writer of our dreams. And many, many people, including Edmund Wilson and lots of people at his level, immediately took her up. They just adored her. She was also Irish, and she drank like the men. So they right down here in the village, she hung out with all these famous guys, and they adored her. They all drank together, and whatever. So and she wrote a lot of books which were meant to be satires of socially connected people in New York, of which she was not one, right? She wasn't, but she observed. And those books got a lot of attention. Gore Vidal wrote passionately, but got a lot of attention, and then she disappeared. Long before she died, she disappeared. But she was writing diaries all the time, and the diaries are really scintillating. The diaries are really, she's brittle, and she's also deep, and she's also pained and smart and funny, and really funny in the diaries. But she watched herself disappear from the scene, which is very, very painful, really painful. She wrote, with every book, she would write, oh God, 2 weeks from now, publication date, I can't read the New York Times for a month. It was really, it was very heart moving, right, to read those diaries. So I read the diaries and then I read the novels, and I thought the novels were very weak. They were republished because there were a couple of people Tim Page, who adored her. They got them published, but it didn't go anywhere. I asked a lot of people over time if they read her, and when they did, I asked, what did you think? And most people had my experience, but a lot of people had yours too. But yeah, she's a moving case as the writer's life goes. Edmund Wilson once wrote in his diaries, he came back to New York on a visit, and he saw Dawn. And Dawn was living in some, god-awful dump, some lousy flat in the village. And she said to him, isn't this great? Which means you can imagine where she had been living if she said that. And he was absolutely stunned and stricken. He loved her. On the other hand, he said she never stopped complaining, and he didn't like that at all. He admired Juna Barnes, who was still alive, and she didn't complain at all. Edmund Wilson did not like complaining women.
We have a question over here.
Hi.
Hi.
I was wondering, so for this project, this experience of rereading, if you could speak to what I imagine was a tandem experience of rewriting, or at least revisiting writing that you had engaged with in your process of reading the first time.
You mean, what is it like to reread something I've written?
Yeah, and then re-engage with it.
What's it like?
Now. Yeah.
Well, I hardly ever do it. It's every which way. I mean, there are times I read something that I wrote a long time ago and I'm appalled. And there are other times I think, oh, not so bad. And then, it's every which way. It's really, there's nothing special to say about that. Michelle?
I'm wondering if you could say something more about the end of the novel of love and what you were describing about your relationship to Colette.
Mm.
And what you said, which I was very interested to hear you say, that when your commitment to feminism as a political activist started to wane, writing felt like a feminist act, if I understood that correctly.
Yeah, well, what I meant by that was that I wanted, as most of us did, we wanted to look upon feminism as an instrument of our own growing strength. In other words, I associated the ideology to making myself a stronger person. So for the most part, like with every other movement for social justice, people take strength from being together, from working together, from getting out in the street, from doing political activism. When that political activism came to an end for me, I thought, well, what am I left with here? How am I going to make use of what I've learned, of what I've thought and felt? And I thought, the only thing I can do to honor feminism is to make myself a stronger person.
Hey folks, if you have a question, if you don't mind waiting until we hand you a microphone, that would be awesome.
Oh, sorry. Oh, we can do it.
Yeah, I just was wondering with that realization and what your reading of Colette is, as well as your the book on the end of the novel of love.
Yeah.
Do you think it's some kind of ironic outcome that these kinds of passionate love lives of these women that felt so promising when there wasn't when feminism wasn't as alive?
Which part is ironic?
Well, I'm thinking in the 19th century, the books you write about in the end, maybe you want to say something larger about the end of the novel of love, what that is, because that seems to me to relate to what you're saying about Colette, right?
Well, the thing that the women's movement did put into the world was the great question of the place of love in somebody's life. Mm-hmm. And from there to journalism was one easy leap, you know, to looking at, could love still be a great metaphor? Could love still be the entry into the into something having to do with the human condition, out of which great literature could come? Mm-hmm. So that seems an easy move, right, from one to the next. It was the women's movement, above all. I mean, for this, I think it gets all good marks historically. We can go on with that for a long time, but anyway, that's it. Yeah, sorry.
So I wanted to ask you about the voice, and I loved what you said, that the Village Voice, that you were all putting a gun to society's head.
Yeah.
I love that. So
So did we.
You must have thought, well, you must have thought in the time since then, what it would take to recreate that. And if it's possible even in the age of the internet, where everything is so fractured, would it even matter to have a single publication or a single...
No.
It wouldn't? We're past that?
No, you know, the internet, you just said it. I mean, it's like, it's an octopus, it's many hydra-headed thing that there's no coherence to any of it. What is amazing is how much it does influence. For instance, I know that when something happens, this was the first time I ever saw this, was when, I think it was Mitt Romney, you remember that? When he said he had binders full of women, you remember that? Well, within 24 minutes, the whole internet lit up with women all over the country saying, what? And I was thrilled by that. That's the way the internet can be of use. But thousands of young people today call themselves socialists. They have no place to go with it. There is no party. There is no... It's another world. I don't know how it will reconfigure itself, but reconfigure it does. There's no single publication that can do what we thought we were changing the world. Or not, or just being old-fashioned muckrakers. Yeah, you know it as well as I do.
The journalists at The Voice did change writing.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
you can't,
writing.
So many writers now on the internet, even though there isn't a single Village Voice-like
Yeah,
publication.
yeah.
It's impossible to imagine their writing
Without the Village Voice.
that 1970s.
I don't know if that's good or bad, yeah.
I think it's it's good. That voice has been absorbed and like taken up by new generations.
Yes, definitely. Well, now it doesn't feel like a generation, just the whole world. It's utterly, it's so immense in its not outspokenness, in the opinionated atmosphere.
Like that thing of holding a gun to society's head.
Yeah.
Everyone's doing that now.
Everyone's doing it, and therefore nobody's doing it. Yeah.
Perhaps.
The thing that's so shocking is people write the most unbelievable things on the internet, and you think, oh my God, we can't live past this. And then it goes right on like nothing happened, right? You know, it's unbelievable. You used to think in John Cheever's day, he would write a story at the end of which there would be such a revelation of this terrible marriage. And you would say, oh, they can't go on like this. And they'd go on. And in Cheever, they didn't go on. 20 years later, it was like, oh, okay, pass the salt, so.
I think there's a question over here if we can get a microphone.
Here you go. My father was a born-again Christian and read and reread the Bible. And he said that every time he read the Bible, he learned something new and he had a different perspective. But it wasn't really him, it was the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit was reading with him and helping him. Now, I'm not asking you if you have the Holy Spirit, but whether there's, in a sense, like a person, a presence, a hovering, a something that is also part of the reading and rereading. Not in a spiritual sense, but in...
Superego, baby.
Oh, interesting.
I couldn't use any of those terms. I really couldn't. I'm secular to the bone. I couldn't use those terms. But I certainly feel there are many ways in which I feel the awesomeness of life and And I think that's operating when I reread. If I reread and I'm suddenly struck by what I'm reading, I feel again the thrill of existence, of human existence. That is something, yeah, I can speak in that way. Yes, definitely. To reread, to read and to reread is really to feel the thrill of human existence, the excitement, the awesomeness of it. But I couldn't ever use those terms. But I'll sit down next to your father with that one.
We'll get him over here.
Yeah, we'll get him over here, right.
Hello, hi. Earlier you had mentioned that when you were involved in the feminist movement, it was more a matter of pointing things out, and then you noticed that later on there was like more anger and more division. Like, if you were able to give advice to the movement now, because I also noticed that there's creating more division, like what advice would you give where we can point out what needs to be heard, but without creating as much of a division?
Don't feel murderous.
Well, what kind of there's a one youngish feminist writer who I think does it really wonderfully. That's Rebecca Traister. She has a really even temper. She doesn't ever let go intellectually of the point she has to make. At the same time, she's not yelling and screaming, and she doesn't want their heads. And I think there'll be more and more of that. 2017 was the worst year. It was the year in which people were exploding all over the place. And lots of people were being really punished successively. And a lot of vigilante politics. I think that has curved. Doesn't feel like that anymore. And I think more and more people will become, when blood fills the head, you're not really thinking. So, but I think more and more women, youngish women, are really, women in their 40s especially, I think they're really thinking more and more. And the more they think, the more things will change. I do believe that.
Okay. Any more questions? We have time for one more.
Oh, there's one over here. Okay, so that'll be our last question for the evening.
Hi. I was wondering, how do you decide when to reread certain books?
Oh, that's a good question for which I don't really have an answer. It's emotion. I hate to say it. It's purely emotional. It's really purely emotional. I could never understand myself why I suddenly have an urge. A book comes into my head, and I suddenly have an urge to go right to the place on the bookshelves and pick it up and drop everything else and read. I don't really know why, but that's mysterious. But it's definitely an emotional need of some sort. Just had it the other day. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Vivian.